believe it is our responsibility to resist the injustices done by government in our names. We pledge to bring about freedom and peace. Another world is possible, and we pledge to make it real.
This is Anarchast. Everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I have coming in from Annapolis, Maryland, Adrian Day of Adrian Day Asset Management, and I've known him for quite a while, and I've known of him for even longer than that. He's quite well known, very well known in the financial community. I met him originally, I believe, at Doug Casey's place in Café Jate a number of years ago. Really smart, wise guy, and not wise guy, but a smart and wise person, and I think we'll probably get into quite a bit of stuff about the markets and stuff like that. It all depends on what he wants to talk about, but I think he's very knowledgeable in those areas, so it'd be very interesting to get his input, including things like gold and things like that. But before we get into that, Adrian, the thing that I always like to ask everybody first is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, that's a good question. I think most people are born anarchists, but that doesn't last very long. Particularly once you go to school and you start getting indoctrinated. And I think what happens when you go to school and get indoctrinated, some people just submit to the indoctrination and other people start resisting it, and they either, maybe become conservatives or more libertarians. But I think, to be more serious, with me, I was brought up in England. I was heavily involved in conservative politics in England, and by conservative I mean, the Conservative Party. And there's always been not always, but there is a heavy sort of libertarian wing to the Conservative Party. And I got attracted to people like, I don't know if the name means anything to you, Jeff, people like Enoch Powell, who has he was a member of the cabinet in the 60s and 70s. But he was very free market, shall we say, rather than he certainly wasn't an anarchist, but he was very free market. So I became attracted to that wing of the party, leading members being people like Enoch Powell. There was also the old Liberal Party also retained, the Liberal Party in England also retained a wing that was sort of old style liberal. And from there, I sort of just, I think what happened was when you listen to the logic of freedom, some people, I started to take it to its logical conclusions. If this is good and this is bad, well, why isn't more of this good and less of that better? When I came to this country, I read people like, Henry Hazlitt, who, I'm talking about the early stages of my development. Henry Hazlitt was a great influence, and people like that. And I just read all the classics, people like Bastiat and so on. But I think when I was in England, one of the things that was very formative for me was getting involved with the Institute for Economic Affairs, which some of you may know. It's a think tank in England that was certainly largely responsible for getting Margaret Thatcher on the right track, or sort of on the right track. And I know it's perhaps strange to talk about Margaret Thatcher in the connection of anarchism, but when you think what England was in most of the 60s and 70s, you can see that Margaret Thatcher was a huge improvement. And the Institute for Economic Affairs used to bring in leading politicians and mix them with journalists and students and thinkers and try to convert politicians, shall we say. And it was through the Institute for Economic Affairs that I met Hayek. Actually attended some of his guest lectures at the London School of Economics. So he was obviously a great influence.
Oh, wow, you're the first person I've had on Anarchast, I think, that has met Hayek. I don't remember anyone ever mentioning that. So tell us a little bit about that.
I'm a little older than some of your people, of course. I was thinking when you were introducing me that wise is actually a euphemism for old. But I don't take offense. I was at the London School of Economics. Hayek, as you probably know, was a lecturer at the London School of Economics in the 1930s, which was before I was born. But while I was at the London School of Economics, he came back to do a series of guest lectures. So I was very fortunate to attend some of those lectures. And then at the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of the things they did, as I said, was try to mix people. So they would host regular luncheons of maybe 6 or 8 people. And I was extremely fortunate to be invited to 2 of those luncheons, small luncheons, where Hayek was the guest of honor. So that was a great privilege. And I, you know, Hayek is obviously not an anarchist either, but I have to say that I truly respect Hayek as one of the great thinkers and gentlemen, frankly, of all time.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that Hayek wasn't an anarchist, neither was Ludwig von Mises, but they formed a lot of the free market thought on economics, and it's a lot of people kind of bring that up every now and then. They'll sort of say, well, they weren't anarchists, so that's why I'm not an anarchist. But that train of thought, this anarcho-capitalist thought, wasn't really around during their time. This has been an emerging thought process that sort of started around with Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard and those sort of people. There was, of course, hundreds of years before that of sort of these thoughts, but it never really got totally sorted out, I guess you could say, until recently. And it's interesting to see that they weren't, but they did form such a huge part of the Austrian economics basis.
No, absolutely. And I mean, individuals develop. You think of Hayek. I mean, towards the end of his, when I say towards the end, but later on in his life, he talked about ideas like free money, competing currencies, which was considered extremely radical at the time. And I don't think in the 1930s or 1940s he talked about competing currencies. I mean, people develop as they age, or as they mature. And then I think the other thing is that schools of thought develop. I mean, you think of, for example, Adam Smith. Adam Smith wasn't an Austrian, he certainly wasn't an anarchist, but a lot of people, a lot of thinkers in the 19th century developed with Adam Smith as a base. So you think of people like Adam Smith and some of the other people, John Stuart Mill, and so on. And thinking just develops as it progresses. So I see people like Rothbard as a natural progression from Hayek and von Mises, who were a natural progression from Bastiat, who was pretty anarchist actually, but from Bastiat and from other people who are a natural progression from Adam Smith. And I guess I see my own journey in that way. When I was in my teens, I would have thought Adam Smith was pretty radical and cool, and I'm with Adam Smith. I used to belong to the Adam Smith Society with an Adam Smith tie. But as years progress, you become more. Your thinking develops. I like to think it becomes more correct.
Yeah, I like to think that way too. And I think it also builds on the evidence. So a lot of these theories come about, and then you can actually see them happening in the real world a lot. And as those progress, people start to figure out which things seem to be actually working and which obviously don't with human nature. Because obviously this isn't a science, this isn't a laboratory. The world isn't a laboratory where you can have test cases. You just have to see how things actually work in the wild. And even if it's never been proven at all that anarcho-capitalism doesn't work. We've never really had, in modern times, the opportunity to try it. And no one wants to let us try it. They're all scared of it. They think, well, it'll just be chaos and all this. But we've tried every single other form. We've tried all the royalties and even communism. I have said this before. If I was around the 1930s and I wasn't aware of all the bodies of work that I'm aware of today, I probably would have said, yeah, this communism thing sounds like really great. Like everyone shares everything, and no one really has to work too hard, or everyone has to work hard. And we've seen countless examples now that it just doesn't work with human nature, because people need incentive, and the drive to get ahead is what really drives people, and the drive to improve their lives is really what drives people. And we've just seen it just doesn't work. And it's amazing how so many people, including in the U.S. government, which is mostly communist, if you look at the tenets of communism, that's central banking, public schools, massive amount of involvement in the economy. It's got, I think I wrote once, 8 or 9 of the top tenets of communism is actually what the U.S. government does today, and people keep trying these things. Do you see any hope for change, not Barack Obama hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, and sort of to develop that theme a little bit, but also to go back to what we were saying earlier. I mean, thinkers, however deep they are, thinkers tend to respond to the environment in which they find themselves. So Adam Smith was in a mercantilist environment, so he wrote in response to mercantilism. He wasn't talking about, anarchism, because that wasn't the sort of issue right then. Hayek wrote a lot in his early time in response to Keynesianism, and in the 40s and early 50s he wrote about central planning and the welfare state, because living in England and a lot of and England having a very heavy welfare state, that was the issue that needed addressing. So even deep thinkers tend to write about what is of most concern at that time. I think in the last certainly in the last 40 years, free market has become, and libertarianism with Ron Paul and so on, has become much more accepted, widely followed. And so now, the idea of talking about anarcho-capitalism sort of is not just, I was going to say, way out on left field. I don't know if it's left or right or up or down, but it's not so extreme anymore. Again, I think it's something that we can talk about in this day and age. Now, will it ever be, not ever, but in the near term, will there be any sort of prospect of it being carried out? Well, you've probably heard of a New Country Project, or you may have heard of a New Country Project. And I was involved in a New Country Project when I first came over to this country. The idea basically with the New Country Project was to try to find some way of getting our own country for libertarians. And the idea at the time was an extremely, extremely minimal government, but one with no taxes, and basically complete freedom. A libertarian society, in other words. And we tried various things. We tried buying an island from various governments. We helped various... I was involved in Abaco, where the Abaconians wanted to secede from the rest of the Bahamas. And we had an agreement, we being the New Country Project, we had an agreement with the leaders of the Abaconian people, the natural leaders, the gatekeepers, if you like. But we would get a certain parcel of land, and we could have a libertarian society on that land if we succeeded. In the end, it didn't succeed. But so, things like that. I mean, that's one way of getting towards a libertarian society, a very small and very compact, but nonetheless, a test case, if you like.
Yeah, and going back a little bit to what you're saying about people react to their environment, another excellent example of that was Ayn Rand, who most of her thoughts came because she came from the Soviet Union during some of its worst times, and she saw how it all worked. And I think her mistake was that she went to the U.S. and she kind of assumed that the U.S. was special for reasons that weren't totally rational. She just thought it was just special, and so she actually supported like the U.S. government and some of their ideas. But yeah, that's an excellent point, is that we're reacting to our environment, and you and I are reacting to our environment today by saying this is not working. The thing that seems to work is libertarianism, and it also just happens to be the most philosophically solid arguments and the most moral argument. It's a beautiful concept. Anarchy is don't hurt anybody, and you don't want anyone to hurt you, and you don't want to rule over anyone, you don't want them to rule over you, and yet this is constantly being fought against as though we're dangerous people. And you brought up interesting subject on how that libertarians have been trying to find a place of their own. It's almost like we're like the Jews from the Bible. We're going from place to place looking for a place where people will just leave us alone. And of course, there's so many examples of what's going on. There's a number of people working on that, and I've been involved with a few of them as well, including the Honduras Project, which is starting to happen this year. And they're going to have free zones, and it looks like it's going all through this year. So if that happens, I'll be heading down there quite a bit. And of course, I also spend time with Doug Casey, and we're always trying to find a country on earth that's doing pretty bad, and see if we can get them to sell us half their land or give us half their land, and make it into a new Hong Kong.
No, same thing. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, but you're absolutely right about people responding to the environment. But you just mentioned something there. You talked about libertarian works and government doesn't work, absolutely, and you mentioned moral. And I think I first came to this from the moral point of view because, you know, you start with the moral or ethical question of, does someone have a right to tell someone else how to live their life? That's a basic rule, isn't it? And you know, when you think it through logically, you have to come to, I think you have to come to the conclusion that, you know, half free or 3/4 free, you know, isn't good enough. If the moral argument is for freedom, and that government which governs best governs least, or the other way around, I always forget, then you take it to its logical conclusion, and the best form of government is no government. And the best form of freedom is 100% freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a libertarian or anarchist, they're basically the same thing, really, in my mind, meme going around. It's a surgeon, and he's doing surgery to remove a tumor on a patient. And he goes, okay, we've removed 80% of the tumor. That's good. Let's stitch him up. And that's basically what we're saying is if it's 80% removal of it is awesome. Like, that's really great. If you get 80% of the tumor removed, why not remove all of it? And people are slowly coming to the realization of that, but it's going to take time, I think, unfortunately. But I know you're a really busy guy, and I really want to ask you about your view on the markets and what's going to happen, because you're so knowledgeable in that area. What's your view on what's going to happen in, say, the next 10 years in terms of the US dollar, the markets, things like that?
Well, 10 years is a long time, admittedly, but I'm a long-term investor. What I do when I look at the long term, I try to think what are the logical possibilities or probabilities, and then you either invest with those trends or you stand aside, but you certainly don't invest against those trends. And I tend not to be, I'm not a trader, so we don't sort of buy gold, short gold, buy gold again, sell gold, short gold, and so on. We're either long or we're neutral. You know, when I look ahead over the next 10 years with regard to the US, some things seem fairly clear to me. Let's see. It's clear that the US is losing its dominant position in the world GDP. Now, of course, you can reduce the percentage of world GDP only because other people are growing faster, and that's certainly what's been happening in the last 20 years. But if you look back, say, over the last, the number would be 1999, so if you look back over the last 15 years, you see that the US share of the world's GDP has gone from about 34% down to about 23%. And I'll qualify those numbers in a second, if I may, just for clarification. But that's a pretty dramatic decline in the percentage of world GDP over what is, in historical terms, a very, very short period. Now, it's partly because the US has stagnated, but of course it's even more importantly because China and other countries have grown much more dramatically. And I don't see anything horrific in that. I'm not an American, of course, I'm British, but I don't see anything horrific in that. Empires come, empires go. It's a natural state of affairs. And if your standard of living stays the same, if it stays the same while others are growing faster, I don't see anything you know, abhorrent or perverse about that. Right now, in fact, East Asia in general is actually has a higher GDP than does the US. I said I was just going to make one comment, if I may, and ask for any of your readers to look up the numbers and see different numbers. When you look at GDP, you'd think it was a fairly easy thing and fairly objective thing to do, but of course it's not. If you're comparing one country's GDP with another country's GDP, there's lots of assumptions you have to make. One assumption would be, do you just take the government figures, or do you include a guesstimate of the black market? Well, the numbers that I quoted include a guesstimate of the black market, and I think that's appropriate because in some countries like Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, I shouldn't call it the black market.
Free market.
Thank you. The free market is a very significant, I know you fall into these bad habits so easily, is a very significant part of the overall economy. So it will be, you know, to my mind, it would be a distortion only to include government figures. The other thing you have to, the other question you have to decide is, do you use official currency rates, or do you use purchasing power parity to compare one GDP with another? So the figures that I've quoted, 33 down to 35 down to 23, are apples to apples, but they may be different from someone else's numbers because someone else's numbers may use different assumptions. So just to clarify that. To me, the US is in a situation that's typical of the end of empire, and it is very, very reminiscent of what Britain looked like in 1945, frankly. Britain in 1945, like America today, is highly indebted, has a growing welfare state that it can't afford. It has its armies and navies around the world in over 100 bases in the case of the US. Britain, of course, had naval bases all over the world. Again, bases that they couldn't afford. And the parallels are really very, very similar. And if you look at what happened to Britain, you know, you saw Britain's standard of living actually decline pretty dramatically from 1945 until 1980, until Thatcher came in, which is why I keep referring to Thatcher, not that she was an anarchist, but she, you know, when you look at what the state Britain was in before, it was really quite horrific. And the British pound, to get to your point about the dollar, the British pound went from 5 to 1 against the dollar all the way down eventually to 1 to 1 against the dollar at the low. So that's a pretty dramatic decline. That took 45, that took 50, well, yeah, 40 years. Things tend to move faster now. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if from the peak in the dollar to the low, we see a decline of 80%. Wouldn't be at all surprised. In fact, why shouldn't we? Because the internal purchasing power of the dollar has gone down by what, 97% since the Federal Reserve came in. So, you know, I think we're going to see a decline in the value of the dollar, and it'll be up and down just as it was with the pound. The big question with empires is, to me, when you look at how an empire declines, either in an absolute sense or a relative sense, the big question is there someone else there to take its place? Now, in the case of Rome, of course, there was no other big power to come along and take its place. That's why you had the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, and so on. In fact, the early medieval period, in my view, was one of the most creative periods, both in terms of philosophy, in terms of architecture, building, I mean, and so on. But that's a different issue. But then when you look at more recent empires, you see, you know, France, I see Spain replaced by the Dutch, replaced by France. And then when the French Empire was at its zenith, it was pretty obvious that Britain was ready to take its place. When the British Empire was at its peak, it was pretty obvious that America was ready to take its place. We're at a situation now where American empire is at its peak, or past its peak, in my view, but there is no country at the moment that is ready to take its place.
Well, that's good, though, isn't it? We don't want another U.S. government or empire, do we?
No, we don't. But I think we're going to get it, whether we want it or not. So, in terms of markets, in terms of economy, the decline in American power and supremacy is going to take longer, I think, because there is no obvious replacement. At some point, China will be ready to take over from the US, and but it'll happen slowly in terms of military power, in terms of economic power, but it'll happen slowly, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting times ahead. I don't know what's going to happen, but my views are that I, of course, write the dollar vigilante. I think all fiat currencies are going to go to zero fairly quickly because of all the debt. We've never had this sort of a system before on planet Earth where all those currencies are fiat, and it's been that way essentially since 1971, and where all these governments, almost all of them, are massively in debt. The amount of debt in the world has gone up from 70 trillion 5 years ago to 100 trillion today. That's almost 50% in 5 years, and a lot of that was government debt. So I see a complete collapse coming.
No, absolutely, and you're right about the debt, of course. This has just been, this experiment, and debt is one of those things that it can go on for quite a while, and you can survive for quite a while, until you reach a point where suddenly your interest payments become too great a burden relative to your income. And we're very close to that point in the US right now. I mean, that's typically what happens. You can build debt as long as your income is growing more rapidly than your debt. And if you're building debt for constructive purposes, such as, say, America or Britain in the 19th century, when a lot of debt, I mean, government debt levels, people often say to me, well, American debt levels in the second half, in the end of the 19th century, were higher than they were today. Well, sure they were, but they were being used, and, as anarchists, we don't think the government should have been doing this, but they were being used for constructive purposes, building railway roads, building canals, and so on. Today it's being used for consumption, for welfare, and that's the huge difference. So you're not creating any more income by the debt. And then suddenly you reach a point where the debt service exceeds your ability, it reaches too high a percentage of your income. That's why I think the Federal Reserve is doing everything in its power to keep interest rates low. It's not because they have sympathy for the unemployed or because they want to boost the mortgage market. It's because the percentage of the federal government's income that goes towards servicing debt, not paying back the debt, but just servicing the debt, has reached an intolerable level. Right now, for example, the average interest rate on all outstanding U.S. government debt, and we're talking federal government, all outstanding federal government debt is a little bit over 2%, right? The 25-year average is 6.5%. So we are barely a third, or we're just about a third of the 25-year average. And yet we're paying about, what now, about 14% of government revenue, federal government revenue, goes towards servicing the debt. So that's at a point when interest rates are at 80-year lows, and when more and more of the debt is short-term debt, where rates are lower. So you start seeing those rates move up. They don't have to move back to Volcker levels. They don't even have to move back to 25-year averages. If they even move halfway back to 25-year averages, then the US government will be paying about 22% of its revenue on debt, which becomes unsustainable. So
Yeah, you're totally right. The U.S. government debt right now is 17 trillion. It's going up by about $1 trillion a year. So if the interest rates went to about 10%, just to do math easy, because I went to public school, I'm not very good at it, that'd be $1.7 trillion. And the total tax theft revenue of the U.S. government is around 2.3 trillion. So even a 10%, which is not by any means an extreme number. During the 1970s, the last time this happened, as you mentioned, with Paul Volcker, it went to a peak of about 18%. And the economy is much worse today. There's much more debt. And they actually, yes, yeah, they actually could let it rise at that level because they only had, in 1979, I believe, about $800 billion worth of debt, the U.S. government. And so even 18% didn't overwhelm their tax theft revenue. But today, if it even rises to 10%, it almost would take up the entire revenue of the tax theft that they do. And of course, at the same time, if that's happening, you're going to see just an implosion in the economy because everyone else has so much debt too, with mortgages mortgages and things like that. You'd see all the banks starting to collapse. So the tax revenue theft from the U.S. government would actually plummet. So I just see nothing but complete wasteland disaster ahead for the U.S. and most of the Western countries.
No, absolutely, I agree with you completely. And you know, that's why we're going to have rates kept artificially low as long as they can. We're also going to see a depreciating currency, because obviously that helps you if you have to pay back money that you owe to foreigners. It obviously helps to do it in depreciated dollars. We're also going to see, I mean, we're not going to see much in the way of government spending reduced, but we will see, you know, things at the margin, people default. You know, we talk about default. Well, if you've made a promise to people on Social Security, which you and I both know is nothing but, you know, theft, is stealing from future generations. It's not a, you know, it's nothing that people have really earned. And I know people don't like to hear that. But you know, but if you've made that commitment to pay people and then you start cutting back on that, to me that's a default on your obligation. We're going to start seeing more and more of that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and talking about socialist insecurity, it actually could have been their money, but if the government actually kept any of it, but they've actually just used it, they actually counted as part of their income in their tax theft revenue base. The socialist insecurity payments is actually part of the revenue base of the U.S. government, so you take that out, and so you get a lot of people who are living on socialist insecurity, and they say, hey, that's my money, and yeah, it could have been your money, but you were robbed decades ago and you didn't notice or didn't do anything about it. And so all it really is it's just being paid for now by younger people who aren't very happy about it. And so it's going to be interesting what's going to happen in the next few years. So briefly on the investment side, I presume that you're quite weighted towards precious metals and hard assets based on what you think is going to happen. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. So the basic premise I have for the next 10 years is of a dollar that depreciates dramatically. And so how do you guard against a dollar? Well, a couple of things. One is precious metals. We're very heavily weighted towards precious metals. We have about 25% of even our conservative accounts in gold. Now, of course, there's a different kind of gold stock for a conservative person than for an aggressive person, but we still have a very high weighting towards gold and precious metals. That's number one. But I think the other way to fight against protect against the dollar, obviously, is to buy equities in the currencies of countries, in the currencies that you think will rise against the dollar. Even though they're fiat currencies, they're still going to do better than the dollar. So we have a lot of Singapore companies, Hong Kong companies, and these are typically, I mean, I think the Hong Kong dollar, the Singapore, most of the Asian currencies are very undervalued relative to the US dollar. So over the next 10 years, I can easily see those currencies appreciating. So we're buying good quality companies in those markets as well.
Interesting. Yeah, we should wrap this up because I know you're a very busy guy. Why don't you let us know where we can get more information, perhaps Adrian Day Asset Management's website or anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I appreciate that, yes. Adrian, the website is adriandayassetmanagement.com, or you can just go to adrianday.com and that takes you to it. And you know, the website has all the information about the money management. People can also call the office if they want to, 410-224-2037.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Adrian Day. It's been a pleasure. A very interesting guy and a lot of interesting economic and anarchist theories. And actually having met Hayek, the first person I've known who's done that, that's really interesting. So I'd like to thank Adrian Day of Adrian Day Asset Management. And this has been another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.